On a cold morning in the spring of 1886, a county deputy named Harlan Wilkes stood in front of a barn he had passed 100 times before, and for the first time in his life he was afraid of it. The great doors were shut. The windows had been boarded over from the inside, and somewhere beneath the floor, in a cellar that no survey of the property had ever recorded, 44 human beings were waiting to be found. Wilkes did not know that number yet. Nobody did. What he knew was that travellers had been vanishing along this stretch of Missouri Road for the better part of 4 years, and that nearly every one of them had last been seen turning up the lane toward the Braddock Brothers' place. He knew that letters home had simply stopped. He knew that families 2 states away had already given up and begun to grieve. And he knew, standing there with a crowbar in his cold hands and his breath fogging in the grey air, that whatever he was about to pull out of the ground was going to unmake everything he thought he understood about his own county. This is the story of the Braddock Brothers' barn. It is a story that, according to nearly every official record that survives, never happened at all. And by the time we are finished tonight, you are going to understand exactly why somebody wanted it that way. Before we go any further, I need you to do one small thing. Down in the comments, type the single word, remember. Just that. Because the entire point of this story is that somebody, a very long time ago, decided you were never meant to hear it, and every comment left on this video is a quiet refusal to let it stay in the dark. So type the word remember, then tell me which part of this you already sense is being hidden from us, and let me know where in the world you are watching from tonight. Now let us go all the way back to the beginning. To understand what happened at the Braddock place, you first have to understand the road. In the 1880s, the middle of Missouri was not the settled, fenced, and tidy country we picture when we imagine old America. It was a threshold. It was the last long stretch of ordinary before the land opened up and carried a person off into the endless West. Thousands of people were moving through it every season, families chasing cheap acreage, peddlers with their wagons loaded down with tin and thread and patent medicine, circuit preachers, land agents, drifters, widows travelling to relatives they had never once met, and children, so very many children, sent along the rails and the wagon roads to households that had agreed to take them in. Most of these travellers were, in the truest sense of the word, invisible. They carried no fixed address. They were expected in one place and remembered in another, and in the wide, dark gap between those 2 points, a person could simply cease to exist, and it might be many months before anyone thought to ask why. That is the first thing you must hold in your mind. The road did not just carry people. The road erased them, gently, as a matter of routine, long before anyone with cruel intentions ever entered the story. A man could leave Ohio in the autumn, aiming for a cousin's farm in Kansas, and if he never arrived, the cousin in Kansas might assume he had changed his plans, and the family back in Ohio might assume he had reached Kansas safely, and both assumptions could sit there quietly, unchallenged, for a year or more. The country was enormous, and the mail was slow, and the living were busy. If you wanted to make people disappear, and make sure that no one came looking too soon, you could hardly have designed a more perfect machine than the American road in that decade. And someone, it seems, understood that perfectly well. The stretch we are concerned with ran through the low, wooded hills of the Ozark country, near a crossroads that the locals called Hollow Ford. It was not a town, not really. It was a scatter of a few houses, a general store that doubled as a post office, a blacksmith, and a church that a preacher visited once a month if the weather allowed. The land around it was hard and beautiful and strange. There were caves in those hills that no one had ever fully mapped. There were sinkholes that opened without warning and swallowed a cow or a fence line overnight. There were old cleared circles in the woods where nothing would grow, and the older residents did not like to talk about how those circles had gotten there or who had cleared them, because the honest answer was that they had already been there when the first settlers arrived, and no one living could say who had come before. Keep that detail. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, it is going to stop feeling like a piece of scenery and start feeling like the whole point. Onto this road, in roughly 1879, came 2 brothers named Silas and Amos Braddock. Where exactly they came from, no one could ever say for certain, and that uncertainty is worth pausing on, because in a place like Hollow Ford, everyone knew where everyone came from. Your people were your passport. But the Braddocks arrived without people. They said they were from back east, and when pressed, they said Pennsylvania, and when pressed a little harder, they changed the subject with the easy, practiced smoothness of men who had answered that question many times before and had learned exactly how much to give. Silas was the elder, tall and quiet and courteous, the kind of man who removed his hat indoors and remembered your children's names. Amos was younger, broader, slower to speak, with a habit of watching a room the way a farmer watches weather. Together they bought a large parcel of land right at the point where the road bent through the trees, and on that land there already stood a barn. For the first year, nothing about the brothers gave anyone a reason to worry. They kept a small herd, they grew a modest crop, and they mostly kept to themselves, which in that country was considered good manners rather than a warning sign. When they came into town, Silas did the talking and Amos carried the loads, and the two of them fell into the rhythm of Hollow Ford as though they had always meant to be there. The storekeeper, a careful old man named Deakins, who had seen a great many strangers come and go, would later say that he had studied the Braddocks the way he studied everyone, waiting for the tell that gave a man away, and that in the case of those two he had never found it. They paid their bills. They spoke well of their neighbours. They asked after your health, and seemed to actually listen to the answer. If they were monsters, and by the end of this we will have to decide whether that word is even large enough, then they were the most patient and disciplined monsters that county had ever produced. And yet, even in that first calm year, a few of the sharper residents noticed small things that did not sit right, things too small to speak aloud without feeling foolish. The Braddocks bought a great deal of lye and quicklime, far more than 2 men and a small herd could account for, and when Deakins once made an idle remark about it, Silas said easily that the old cellar stayed damp and the lime helped keep it sweet, and that was that. The brothers never seemed to sell any livestock, though they were forever buying feed. They kept 2 enormous dogs that did not bark and did not play, and watched visitors with a flat, unblinking attention that made grown men uneasy. And on certain still nights, a neighbour half a mile off swore he could hear a sound coming from the direction of the barn, a low and steady sound he could not name and did not care to. A sound he described only as the noise a very large and very cold room might make if it were breathing. He told no one for years. In a place like that, you learned early which thoughts you kept to yourself. That is the second thing you must hold in your mind, and it is the detail that separates this from an ordinary crime and turns it into something far stranger. The Braddocks did not build the barn. The barn was already there. Before we move on to what the barn really was, stop for a second. What you just heard about the brothers who came from nowhere and the barn that was already waiting for them is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original county records. The missing origins, the waiting barn. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Now, let us talk about the barn. Everyone who saw the Braddock barn agreed on 2 things, and disagreed on almost everything else. The first thing they agreed on was that it was enormous, far larger than anything the surrounding farms could justify, a great long structure of dark stone at the base and heavy weathered timber above, with a roof that seemed to climb higher than the trees around it. The second thing they agreed on was that it was old. Not old the way a barn built in the 1850s was old. Old in a way that made no sense. The stone at its foundation was fitted so tightly and so precisely that a knife blade could not slip between the blocks, and the joints had no mortar at all, which was not how anyone in that county built anything. The timbers above were grey and iron hard, and when the local blacksmith once tried to drive a nail into one of the beams to hang a lantern, the nail bent as though he had struck rock. People said the wood had petrified. People said the barn had been there since before the county had a name. And the Braddocks, when they heard these things repeated, only smiled and agreed that yes, it was a very old building, and they felt lucky to have found it. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that the official story, the version that was eventually allowed to survive, worked very hard to sand down and explain away. The version we were left with says the barn was simply a well-built structure from an earlier homestead, but the accounts that were written down before the official story hardened tell us something else. They tell us the barn had proportions that were wrong. The doors were too tall. tall enough that a man on horseback might have passed through without stooping, which no farmer would ever have troubled to build. The interior was deeper than the exterior seemed to allow, a discrepancy that more than one visitor noticed and could never quite resolve, the kind of small wrongness that the eye registers before the mind can name it, leaving a person vaguely uneasy without knowing why. And the sound inside it was wrong too, the way a sound behaves in a space far larger and far older than it appears, a heavy stone silence that swallowed voices and gave back a cold that had nothing to do with the weather outside. And below the main floor, cut into the living rock of the hillside, there was a cellar, and the cellar had walls of the same seamless-fitted stone layer as the foundation, and no one in Hollowford had ever dug it, because it, too, had been there when the Braddocks arrived. The brothers used that cellar for storage. That is what they told people, and for a long time people believed them, because why on earth would they not? For the first 2 years, the Braddocks were simply good neighbours, and this is the detail that makes the whole thing so hard to sit with. They were helpful, they were generous. When the Hensley family lost their roof in a storm, Silas Braddock was there the next morning with timber and his own 2 hands. When money ran short after a bad harvest, Amos was known to let a debt slide for a season without a word of complaint. They attended church when the preacher came. They bought their supplies at the store and paid in full. And crucially, they let it be known, quietly and kindly, that any traveller passing through who needed a place to rest for the night was welcome to stop at the Braddock place, where there was a warm meal, a dry corner of the barn to sleep in, and no charge asked of an honest wayfarer. In a hard country, that reputation spread fast. Word travelled up and down the road. If you were passing through the Ozark Hills near Hollowford and the dark was coming on, you looked for the lane that turned toward the big old barn, because the Braddock brothers would see you right. You already know where this is going. But the people on that road did not. And that is the horror of it, the real horror, underneath all the strangeness we are going to uncover. These were not fools. They were not careless. They were tired, decent people at the end of a long day, doing exactly what a tired, decent person should do, which is to trust the kind stranger who offers shelter from the night. Every instinct that kept them alive on that road, the instinct to seek warmth, to accept kindness, to believe that most people mean well, was the exact instinct that turned them up that lane and toward that barn. The Braddocks did not hunt their victims. They did not have to. They simply built a reputation for mercy, and then waited by the door for mercy to bring the travellers to them. We can reconstruct, from the fragments, how a night at the Braddock place most likely went, and I think it is important that we do, because the ordinariness of it is the most chilling thing about it. A traveller would come up the lane in the last of the light, tired and weary, and the weariness would drain away the moment Silas Braddock stepped out onto the porch with his hat in his hand and that easy, courteous manner, and welcomed the stranger by asking after the road and the weather, and whether they had come far. There would be a meal, a real one, hot food and coffee, served without any hint of the hurry a swindler shows. Amos would see to the traveller's horse if they had one, or their pack if they did not, all of it done with the unhurried competence of men who had nothing to hide. There would be talk by the fire, and the talk would gently establish the only things the brothers truly needed to know, whether anyone knew this traveller was here, whether anyone was expecting them soon, whether there was a person close enough to come looking quickly. A kind question about your family is also a way of learning whether your family will miss you. And then, when the hour grew late and the traveller's guard was fully down, worn away not by trickery but by genuine warmth, they would be shown to a place to sleep, a dry corner of the great old barn, and they would lie down grateful for the mercy of strangers, and that is the last that the world outside would ever know of them. The brothers did not need weapons drawn in a struggle. They needed only patience, hospitality, and the cellar that was already waiting in the dark beneath the floor. It is a terrible thing to realize that the very kindness which made them beloved was the mechanism of the crime, that every warm meal was a measurement, and that the travellers died precisely because the Braddocks were so good at seeming good. The first person we can name with any confidence is a peddler. His name, as best as the fragments allow us to reconstruct it, was Josiah Kern, and he worked the roads of 3 states with a wagon full of pots, needles, ribbon, cheap knives, and the small necessary things that isolated farm families could not easily get for themselves. Men like Kern were the arteries of that whole country. They carried news as well as goods. They knew every farm and every family on their circuit, and every family knew roughly when to expect them, which is precisely why Kern is the first victim we can be sure of. When a peddler who has come around every autumn for 11 years simply fails to appear, and then fails to appear the year after that, people notice. They notice slowly, because a peddler might change his route or fall ill or take another road, but they notice, and when Kern's disappearance was finally set down beside the others, years later, one small detail came with it. The last farm he had visited before he vanished lay just north of Hollow Ford, and the wife of that farm remembered clearly that Josiah Kern had told her, as he packed up his wagon in the failing light, that he meant to press on a few more miles that evening, because there was a big old barn down the road where a couple of decent fellows would put a man up for the night at no charge. He was, she said, in good spirits when he left. She never saw him again, and neither did anyone else who would live to tell of it. After Kern, the pattern is harder to trace only because the victims were, by design, the hardest people in America to miss. Think about who was most likely to accept the offer of a free bed in a stranger's barn. Not the wealthy, who could pay for a room at a proper inn. Not the local, who had a home to go to. The people who turned up that lane were the poor, the solitary, the passing through, the ones with no one waiting close enough to raise an alarm quickly. A widow moving west to a brother she had not seen in 20 years. A young man walking to a new job at a railhead. A pair of labourers with no families at all. An immigrant couple who spoke little English and knew no one for 500 miles. These were the travellers the road was already built to erase, and the Braddocks simply positioned themselves at the exact point where erasure was easiest and let the current bring the drowning to them. For every disappearance that was eventually counted, we should assume there were others that were never counted at all, people so far outside the web of anyone's concern that their absence made no ripple whatsoever. This is the part that historians of the case, the few who have dared to touch it, find hardest to accept. The 44 is not the true number. The 44 is only the number that could be proven. The true number is a thing we will never know, and the not knowing is itself a kind of monument to how thoroughly the machine worked. But absence given enough time begins to speak, and the way it first began to speak was through letters that stopped coming. There was a rhythm to correspondence in that era, a slow and reliable heartbeat. A daughter who reached her new home in the West would write to her mother back east within a few weeks, and the mother would write back, and so a thin thread of paper would keep the family connected across a distance that they would otherwise never cross again in their lives. That thread was sacred. It was often the only thing a family had, and so when the thread went silent, when the expected letter never came and the anxious letter sent in reply was never answered, a very specific and terrible kind of dread began to grow in kitchens and parlours hundreds of miles from Hollow Ford. At first the families told themselves stories. She is busy with the new farm. The mail has been lost. He never was much for writing. They held those stories as long as they could, because the alternative was unbearable. But eventually, in more homes than anyone realized at the time, the stories ran out, and a mother or a father or a sister sat down and wrote a different kind of letter, a letter addressed not to the missing loved one but to a sheriff or a postmaster in a distant county, asking, in careful and frightened words, whether anyone out there had seen their girl, their boy, their husband, who had been travelling the road near a place called Hollow Ford and had not been heard from since. Here is the thing about those letters. They arrived one at a time, over a span of years, to different offices, read by different men, and not one of those men had any way of knowing that a dozen other such letters existed. A postmaster in Hollow Ford might receive an anxious inquiry about a missing traveller and feel a moment of genuine pity, and make a note, and ask around, and hear nothing, and eventually file the letter away and move on with his life, never suspecting that he was holding one small piece of the largest atrocity his county would ever produce. The horror was distributed. It was spread so thin across so much time and so much distance that no single person was ever holding enough of it at once to see its shape. And that, I want to suggest to you now and prove to you before the end, was not an accident of geography. That was a feature. Somebody understood that a crime broken into small enough pieces, scattered across a wide enough map, becomes effectively invisible, and somebody built a life around that understanding. Consider a young man we know only as Tobias, whose story survives because, unusually, someone was waiting for him at the other end. Tobias was walking west to take up a paying position at a railhead work camp, a job that had been arranged for him by letter, and the foreman of that camp expected him on a particular day. When he did not arrive, the foreman did what almost no one else in this story was in a position to do. He noticed immediately, because a man who fails to show up for a job that starts on a fixed date is missed at once. The foreman made inquiries back along the road, and those inquiries eventually reached the same short stretch near Hollow Ford, and the trail ended, as every trail in this story ends, at the lane that turned toward the barn. But even here, with a man being actively expected and actively missed, the machine held. The foreman was busy, the camp moved on, the inquiry cooled, and Tobias joined the growing ranks of the vanished. If even the expected could be erased this cleanly, imagine how effortless it was to erase the unexpected, the ones no one was counting the days for at all. Or consider the immigrant couple, whose names come down to us mangled and uncertain because no one at Hollow Ford could spell them and no record-keeper cared to try. They had come across an ocean and half a continent, chasing the promise of land, and they spoke almost no English, which meant that they were, in the cruelest sense, already invisible before they ever reached Missouri. They knew no one for hundreds of miles in any direction. They could not have raised an alarm even if they had lived to try. They had, in all likelihood, been directed toward the Braddock barn by some well-meaning stranger who told them, slowly and with gestures, that there was shelter ahead, and they had gone gratefully, because when you are far from home and cannot even ask for help in the local tongue, the offer of a warm, dry corner from a smiling man is a mercy you do not question. Somewhere across the ocean, it is entirely possible that a family waited for years for a letter that would tell them their son and his wife had reached the new country safely and begun their new life. That letter never came, and those distant people almost certainly went to their own graves never knowing why, adding one more unmarked question to the vast ledger of the forgotten. This is the true scale of the thing. For every victim we can name, there is a widening circle of people who loved them and were never told, a grief that spread outward across oceans and generations and simply never found its answer. A parent, a sibling, a child, a friend, each of them left holding a silence they could not explain, each of them slowly building a private story to fill the gap where a person used to be. And every one of those private stories was wrong, because the truth was locked in a cellar in Missouri that none of them would ever hear about. Multiply that grief by 44, and then by all the ones who were never counted, and you begin to feel the real weight of what was done, a weight measured not only in the dead but in every living heart that was quietly broken and never told why. Let me tell you about one of those letters in particular, because behind every one of them was a real and specific human being, and the moment we let them become a number is the moment we join the people who buried them. Her name was Eleanor Voss, and she was a school teacher. She was 26 years old in the year she vanished, and by every account she was exactly the sort of person a small hard place is lucky to receive and grieved to lose. She had trained in the East and had answered a notice seeking a teacher for a country school 2 counties past, Hollow Ford, a school that served the children of a scatter of farms too poor and too remote to attract anyone else. That she took the position at all tells you what kind of woman she was. She could have stayed in a comfortable town. Instead, she chose the children who had no one, and she set out along the road to reach them, and she carried with her a trunk of books, a small sum of money sewn into the hem of her coat as her mother had taught her, and a heart full of the particular bright determination that the very best young teachers carry before the world has had a chance to wear it down. We know a great deal about Eleanor Voss for one reason. She was a faithful writer of letters, and her younger sister, a woman named Margaret, kept every single one. In those letters we can watch Eleanor travel. We can read her describing the great open country, the strangeness of it, the loneliness and the wonder. And in the very last letter Margaret ever received, we can read Eleanor writing, in her neat and hopeful hand, that the roads had been harder than she expected, and that she was tired but well, and that a kind gentleman she had met on the road had told her of a place a little way ahead where she might rest for a night before the final push to the school. A big old barn, Eleanor wrote, kept by 2 brothers with a good reputation among travellers. She expected to reach it by nightfall. She would write again, she promised, the moment she was settled at the school. She signed the letter with love, and she sealed it. and she posted it at the last village before Hollow Ford, and then Eleanor Voss walked up the road toward the barn and out of the reach of everyone who loved her. Margaret waited for the next letter for 6 weeks before the fear became too much to bear. She wrote to the school and learned that the new teacher had never arrived, that the children had waited and no one had come. She wrote to the county. She wrote to the postmaster at Hollow Ford. She received, in time, kind and useless replies. No one had seen her sister. There was no record. The road was long, and the country was dangerous, and young women travelling alone met with accidents, they told her gently, as though gentleness were a substitute for an answer. And Margaret, alone in the East with a bundle of her sister's letters and a grief that had nowhere to go, did the thing that almost no other family in this story was able to do. She refused to accept it. She did not have the money to travel. She did not have the standing to demand an investigation. But she had the letters, and she had her sister's own words naming the place, and she began, slowly and stubbornly and across years, to pull on the single thread that everyone else had let go of. Hold on to Margaret. She is going to matter more than anyone. But before we return to her, we have to talk about why the county itself was so willing to look away, because that willingness is the second monster in this story, and in some ways it is the more frightening of the two. You might imagine that a series of disappearances along a single stretch of road, all connected to a single property, would eventually force the authorities to act. And you'd be right to imagine that, in a world where the authorities wanted to see, but consider the situation honestly. The county had one sheriff and a handful of deputies to cover a vast and rugged territory. Its records were kept by hand, in ledgers, in a wooden courthouse. There was no system for cross-referencing a missing person reported in one place against a missing person reported in another. Each inquiry was a separate small tragedy, handled separately, filed separately, and forgotten separately. To see the pattern, someone would have had to gather all the scattered pieces into one place and lay them side by side, and there was no person whose job that was, and no reason for anyone to do it, and the Braddocks were well liked and generous, and had never given a soul a reason to suspect them. The system did not fail to catch them. The system was simply not built to catch a thing like them, and they had chosen their ground precisely because they understood that. And then there is the courthouse fire. In the winter, after the events we are building toward, the county courthouse burned to the ground. Fires were common enough in that era of wood buildings and open flame, and on its own the fire would mean nothing. But this fire took with it nearly every land record, every deed, every survey, and every filed inquiry connected to the Hollow Ford district for a span of almost 15 years. The Braddock deed burned. The property surveys burned. The postmaster's accumulated notes on the missing travellers burned. The one place in the world where the scattered pieces might one day have been gathered and compared burned to charcoal in a single night, and the official cause was recorded as a stove left untended. Perhaps that is exactly what it was. I am not going to stand here and tell you I can prove otherwise, but I will ask you to sit with the timing of it, because the timing is the kind of thing that, once you notice it, you cannot stop noticing. Everything that could have been used to reconstruct the truth was gathered, by pure chance, into one wooden building, and then that building was reduced to ash at the precise moment the truth was beginning to surface. And this is a pattern, I want you to understand. This is not the last time in this story that the record of what happened will conveniently cease to exist. It is the first time. Watch for it. It is going to happen again, and each time it happens it is going to be explained away as an accident, and by the end you are going to have to decide for yourself how many accidents in a row still count as accidents. Now I need to tell you about the children, and I will be honest with you. This is the part of the story I find hardest to speak aloud. In those decades, tens of thousands of orphaned and abandoned children were loaded onto trains in the crowded cities of the East and sent west to be taken in by rural families. The trains stopped in town after town, and the children were lined up on platforms and on church stages to be looked over and chosen, and the ones who were chosen went home with strangers, and the ones who were not got back on the train and rode to the next town to be looked over again. It was, for many of those children, a genuine rescue. For others, it was a passage into servitude or worse. And the crucial thing about these children, for our purposes, is that they were the single most erasable human beings in the entire country. They had no families, They had no records that anyone maintained with care. They were passed from institution to household, with paperwork that was casual at best and forged at worst. A child who vanished from that pipeline left, in most cases, no gap that anyone was watching, because the entire point of the pipeline was to move children who had no one watching over them. Some of the travellers who turned up the lane toward the Braddock barn were escorting such children, and some, according to the fragments that survive, were the children themselves. Older ones, teenagers, sent to walk the last miles to a placement on a distant farm. I'm not going to sensationalize this. I'm going to state it plainly, because the plain statement is heavy enough. Among the people who went into that barn and did not come out were children who had already been failed by everyone who was ever supposed to protect them, and whose disappearance from the road caused not one single official inquiry, because officially, in the eyes of the systems of that time, they had already disappeared long before they ever reached Missouri. When we say 44, we are naming the ones who could be proven. The children are, almost by definition, not fully among the proven, and that fact should make every one of us angry in a way that 4 generations of forgetting has tried very hard to smooth away. So, we have the road that erased people. We have the brothers who positioned themselves at the point of erasure. We have a county with no means to see the pattern and a fire that destroyed the means after the fact. And we have, as victims, the exact categories of human being least likely to be missed. Every element of this was aligned, as if by design, toward a single outcome, which was that a great crime could happen in plain sight for years and leave almost no trace, and it very nearly worked perfectly. It would have worked perfectly, and you would never have heard the name Braddock, if not for one grieving schoolteacher's sister who would not let go of a bundle of letters. Margaret Voss spent 4 years pulling on that thread. She began with nothing but her sister's final letter and the name of a place. She wrote letters of her own, dozens and then hundreds of them, to postmasters and sheriffs and newspaper editors, to churches along the route, to the families of other travellers, whenever a chance mention in a newspaper suggested that someone else had gone missing on the same road. And slowly, agonizingly, across those 4 years, Margaret began to do the one thing that no institution in that country had done or would do. She began to gather the scattered pieces into a single place. Every reply she received, she kept. Every name of another missing traveller she wrote down. And as her list grew, the shape of the thing began to rise out of the fog, the same shape that no single postmaster had ever been able to see, because no single postmaster had ever held more than one piece. Margaret held them all. On a sheet of paper, in a quiet room hundreds of miles away, a woman with no authority and no resources assembled the pattern that the entire apparatus of the law had failed to assemble, and at the centre of the pattern, again and again and again, sat a single point on the map. The road near Hollowford, the big old barn, the 2 kind brothers who would put a traveller up for the night at no charge. By the time Margaret had gathered enough to be certain, she had a list of names that ran well past 20, and every one of them had last been placed on that same short stretch of road. She took what she had to anyone who would listen, and for a long time no one would. She was a woman, without money, making an extraordinary accusation against 2 respected men, based on nothing but letters and a list. But Margaret had learned patience from grief, and she kept pressing, and eventually her list reached the desk of a man who could not ignore it, a deputy in the Hollowford district named Harlan Wilkes, the same man we met at the very beginning of this story, standing before the barn with a crowbar and a fear he could not name. Wilkes was not a brilliant investigator. He was something better for our purposes. He was a local man who had known the Braddocks for years, who had eaten at their table, who had liked them, and who was therefore exactly the sort of person capable of feeling the full weight of what Margaret's list was suggesting. Because Wilkes did not want it to be true, he resisted it. He read Margaret's list, and his first honest reaction was anger, a refusal to believe that men he had shaken hands with could be at the centre of something so vast. And then he did the thing that makes him the quiet hero of this account. Despite not wanting it to be true, he checked. He took the list, and he began, one name at a time, to confirm that these people had truly existed and truly gone missing and truly last been seen on that road. And the more names he confirmed, the colder the thing inside his chest became, until one grey morning he could no longer pretend that there was any innocent explanation, and he gathered a few men he trusted, and he rode out to the Braddock place to ask some questions he already dreaded the answers to. What he found when he arrived was that the Braddocks were gone. The house was empty. The great dogs were gone. The herd was gone, and the barn stood shut, its doors barred, its windows boarded over from the inside, silent in the cold. It became clear very quickly that the brothers had left in a hurry, but not in a panic, that they had taken what mattered and abandoned the rest, and that they had known, somehow, that the questions were finally coming. How they knew is one more small mystery in a story full of them. Perhaps someone warned them. Perhaps they simply sensed that Margaret's long pressure had at last found a crack. Whatever the reason, they were gone, and they had left the barn locked behind them, and Harlan Wilkes stood in front of it in the grey morning air and understood that the answer to every question he had was on the other side of those barred doors, and that he was terribly, deeply afraid to open them. He opened them anyway. The inside of the barn, at first, was almost a disappointment. It was clean. That was the thing that Wilkes and the men with him would remember longest, the thing they mentioned again and again in the years afterward when they could be persuaded to speak of it at all. It was clean in a way that a working barn is never clean, swept and scrubbed and orderly, the great dark space empty and cold and quiet. There were no bodies lying in the open. There was no obvious horror waiting just inside the door. For a few long moments the men stood in that swept emptiness, and a shameful hope rose in them, the hope that they had been wrong, that Margaret had been wrong, that there would be some ordinary explanation after all, and they could ride home and forget the cold thing in their chests. And then one of them noticed the smell. It was faint, under the clean, under the lime. It was the smell of the lime itself, the great quantities of quicklime that the Braddocks had bought year after year, and that Deakins, the storekeeper, had never thought to question. Lime does a particular thing. It is used, among its honest purposes, to speed the breaking down of what would otherwise rot slowly and stink for a long time. The men followed the smell across the swept floor to a corner where the boards did not quite match the rest, and they pried up those boards, and beneath them they found the top of a stair cut into stone, descending into the dark, into the old cellar that no map had ever recorded. The cellar that had been there before the Braddocks, before the county, before anyone living could say. And a draught came up out of that opening, cold and steady, carrying the lime and the faint sweet rot beneath it, and Harlan Wilkes lit a lantern with hands that would not stay still, and he went down. I am going to describe what he found carefully, and without cruelty, because the people he found deserved to be remembered as people and not as a spectacle. The cellar was larger than it had any right to be. It ran back into the hillside, far beyond the footprint of the barn above, a long vaulted space of that same seamless fitted stone, cold as a cave and dry as bone. And in that space, over the years, the Braddocks had done their terrible arithmetic. There were remains. There were many of them, in various states, some reduced almost to nothing by the lime and the time, some more recent. There were belongings, sorted and stored with the same awful tidiness as everything else the brothers touched, trunks and cases and bundles that had been stripped of anything valuable and stacked against the ancient walls. There were, Wilkes would say, personal things, a child's shoe, a packet of letters tied with string, a pair of spectacles. The small individual proofs that each of these had been a whole human life, with a family and a destination and a reason for being on that road, before it ended in the cold under the barn. The work of bringing it all up out of the dark took days, and it broke something in every man who did it. They laboured in shifts, because no one could stay down in that cold vaulted space for long, and they came up grey, faced and silent, and did not eat, and some of them wept where they thought no one could see. What made it worse, they would say, was not the horror of the remains, but the tenderness of the belongings, the way the brothers had sorted and stacked the possessions of the dead with such awful neatness, a stack of trunks here, a row of cases there, a box of small personal things kept together as though it mattered, as though, even in the act of erasing these people, the killers had performed a grotesque parody of care. A working man expects, in his darkest imagining of such a place, chaos and filth. What the deputies found was order, and the order was somehow the most frightening thing of all, because order is deliberate, order is a mind at work, Order is proof that this had been done not in a frenzy, but as a practice, patiently, over years, by men who came down here and tidied up afterward and then went upstairs and slept. It is one thing to know that a murder happened. It is another to stand in a cold room and understand that it was a routine. And it was among those belongings, in the days that followed, that the Count was assembled. Wilkes and the others brought up everything they could, and Margaret Voss, who came at last to Hollowford when the news reached her, helped to make sense of it, because Margaret alone held the list against which the belongings could be matched. Name by name, item by item, the missing were accounted for. A trunk of books matched to a schoolteacher. A peddler's stripped and abandoned wares matched to Josiah Kern. Letters matched to the families who had written them. And when the grim work of matching was finally done, when every recoverable trace had been laid out and named as far as it could be named, the number that emerged was 44. 44 human beings, gathered from that single stretch of road across roughly 4 years, ended and hidden beneath a barn that was older than the county that failed to protect them. 44 that could be proven. And every person involved in the counting understood, without needing to say it, that the true number was higher, that the children and the truly friendless had slipped through even this final reckoning, and that some who went into the ground under that barn would never have a name spoken over them by anyone ever again. Among the 44 was Eleanor Voss. Margaret found her sister's trunk. She found the books Eleanor had carried west to teach children who had waited for a teacher who never came. And she found, tied with string exactly as she had kept her own, the small bundle of letters that Eleanor had received from home and had carried with her to the last, the thread of paper that had connected two sisters across an impossible distance, kept safe by a young woman right up until the road delivered her to the barn. I want you to hold that image, because it is the truest thing in this entire story. In a cold cellar of impossible stone, surrounded by the evidence of a horror almost too large to comprehend, a grieving woman knelt and recognized her own handwriting on a bundle of letters, and in that moment the vast anonymous machine of erasure failed, completely and finally, against the single stubborn fact of one person who had refused to forget another. That is what defeated the Braddocks in the end, not the law, not the county. A sister who kept the letters. The brothers themselves were never caught. This is the part that people find hardest to accept, and I understand why, because our stories are supposed to end with the monster in chains. But Silas and Amos Braddock rode away from that barn ahead of the questions and were never, so far as any reliable record shows, seen or heard from again under those names. There were rumours, of course. There are always rumours. Some said they went north and started over in a new territory under new names, and did the same thing again, in a new place chosen for the same reasons, at a new point of erasure along some other road. Some said they died within the year, that the country swallowed them the way it had swallowed their victims. Some said stranger things, which we are going to come to, because those stranger things are the reason this story belongs to a very particular kind of hidden history, and not merely to the annals of crime. But the plain fact, the one we can be certain of, is that the men who did this were never made to answer for it, and that they vanished from the record as smoothly and completely as they had made 44 others vanish. They were, to the very end, better at disappearing than anyone who ever hunted them. I want to pause on what all of this did to Hollowford itself, because the town's response is a crucial and uncomfortable part of the pattern, and it teaches us something about how erasure gets its willing hands. Put yourself in the place of those people for a moment. For years they had liked the Braddocks. They had accepted their help, eaten at their table, spoken well of them to strangers, and, most damning of all, sent travellers up that lane with a warm recommendation, telling weary wayfarers that the brothers at the big old barn would see them right. Every friendly word the people of Hollowford had spoken about the Braddocks had been, without their knowing it, a hand on the back guiding another human being toward the cellar. When the truth came up out of the ground, the town did not only have to grieve the dead, it had to reckon with the fact that its own goodwill, its own neighbourliness, its own trust, had been the very current the killers relied upon. There is no clean way to carry a knowledge like that, and people, faced with a knowledge they cannot carry, do a very predictable thing. They put it down. They stop speaking of it. They discourage others from speaking of it. Not out of malice, most of them, but out of a wound too deep to keep touching. Deakins, the storekeeper, who had sold the brothers their quicklime and their lye year after year and never once let himself wonder why two men needed so much, is said to have closed his store not long after and left the district, unable to stand behind that counter and see, in his memory, the easy face of Silas Braddock buying the very thing he used to unmake the dead. The families of the county, who had to go on living beside that road, beside that field, taught their children not to ask about it, and their children taught their children the same, until within 2 generations the whole thing had shrunk to a half-joke told at the edge of a fire, a shape in the fog, a thing the respectable people insisted had been greatly exaggerated if it had ever happened at all. The town helped bury it, not because anyone ordered them to, but because the truth was unbearable, and forgetting was a mercy they granted themselves. This is the quiet secret of how these histories vanish. It does not always take a conspiracy of powerful men. Sometimes it only takes an ordinary community that cannot live with what it knows, and a patient stretch of years, and the natural human hunger to let a terrible thing lie still. The fires and the lost manuscripts did their part. But so did the simple, understandable, and complete unwillingness of decent people to keep a horror alive in their own mouths. That is why so much of the burden of memory in this story falls on outsiders, on Margaret, who did not live there and did not have to see that field every day, on the Deputy Wilkes, who in the end could not stay either. The people closest to a buried thing are very often the least able to speak of it, and the erasure counts on exactly that. It counts on proximity, breeding, silence, on the wound closing over the wrongdoing until the two become indistinguishable and no one can tell any more where the grief ends and the cover-up begins. When you go looking for hidden history in your own part of the world, remember this: the silence you meet is not always guilt, and it is not always conspiracy. Sometimes it is pain. But pain and conspiracy produce exactly the same result, a truth that no one will say aloud, and the patient process that removes things from the human record is happy to use either one or both to get the outcome it wants. A town that will not speak of its dead, and an archive that has conveniently burned, arrive at the same silence from opposite directions, and the silence is all that the erasure ever needed. And here is where the official story ends, and here is where the official story wants very badly for you to stop asking questions. Because if you accept the official story, then this is simply a tale of 2 wicked men who chose a clever spot and got away with murder, and that is horrifying enough, and most people are content to leave it there. But there are details in this account that the tidy version cannot hold, details that keep leaking out around the edges no matter how many times the story is sanded down, and once you start looking at those details together, a very different and far larger question begins to take shape. The question is not only who the Braddocks were, the question is what the barn was, and what the land under it was, and why every attempt to record the truth of this place has ended in fire, in loss, in silence. Return with me to the stone. Every account that predates the official clean-up agrees on it. The foundation of that barn and the walls of that cellar were built of enormous blocks fitted together without mortar, so precisely that a blade could not enter the joints. That is not how the settlers of that county built. It is not how anyone in that region built. It is, however, exactly how a certain kind of very old structure is built in places scattered all across the world, structures whose true builders and true age the standard history cannot comfortably explain, structures that the official account insists are the crude work of primitive hands, and yet display a precision that modern masons openly admit they would struggle to reproduce. The barn did not sit on a homestead foundation. The barn was built on top of something already ancient, something whose stonework belonged to a tradition that no one in 1879 Missouri possessed. The Braddocks did not build that cellar. They found it. And a reasonable person has to ask what else was down there, in the parts of that vaulted space that ran back into the hillside farther than the barn above could account for, before the brothers ever arrived to put it to their own purpose. Return with me to the road itself. The settlers who came to Hollow Ford did not cut that road. They found it, already there, running straight and old through country where a natural path would have wound and doubled back. Straight roads that predate the people who supposedly built them are not unique to Missouri. They appear again and again in the accounts of settlers all across this continent, ancient causeways and dead straight tracks and cleared lines running through wilderness, always explained away as game trails or lucky coincidences, always older than they should be. And along that particular old straight road, at the exact point where it bent through the trees, stood the barn on its ancient foundation, at a location that people had been avoiding, quietly, for as long as anyone could remember. The cleared circles in the woods where nothing would grow, the sinkholes, the caves no one had mapped, the neighbours who did not like to speak of how those things had gotten there. The land around the Braddock place was already wrong, already the subject of an old and inherited unease, long before two brothers arrived and gave the local people a fresh and specific horror to lay over the older, vaguer one they had never named. And return with me, finally, to the fires. The courthouse burned and took the records with it. That was the first, but it was not the last, and this is the pattern I asked you to watch for. In the decades after the barn was found, on the small number of occasions when someone tried to write the full account down, to gather it into a book or an article, to put it before the public, the effort failed in ways that are difficult to attribute entirely to chance. A local newspaper that ran an early piece on the case saw its offices burn within the year, its back issues lost. A regional historian who was said to be compiling a full account died before the work appeared, and the manuscript was never found among his papers. The site itself was cleared and built over and cleared again, its original stonework broken up and carted away for other uses, until there was nothing left above ground to point to and say, "Here, this is where it happened." Piece by piece, decade by decade, every physical anchor of this story was removed from the world, always by ordinary means, always with an ordinary explanation, until the whole thing had been reduced to exactly the kind of half-remembered rumour that a serious person is expected to dismiss. That reduction did not happen on its own. Stories do not sand themselves smooth. Somebody, or some process, or some quiet and patient pressure that we do not have a good name for, kept reaching back into this account and removing the parts that could be verified, leaving behind only the parts that could be denied. I want to be careful and honest with you here, because you deserve that. I cannot stand before you and prove that a single hand directed the fires, the lost manuscripts, the cleared ground. I cannot show you a document that says, "Erase the Braddock barn," because the entire point of what happened is that such documents do not survive. What I can do is lay the pattern in front of you and let you judge it with your own eyes. A place already ancient and already avoided, a road older than its builders, stonework that does not belong to the people credited with it, a crime that erased the most erasable people in the country, a courthouse fire that destroyed the records at the exact moment they mattered, a newspaper fire, a vanished manuscript, a site broken up and paved over, two men who disappeared as cleanly as their victims, and a story that, despite involving the deaths of at least 44 human beings, you had very likely never heard until tonight. Any one of those, alone, is an accident. All of them, together, pointing in a single direction, is something else. I am not going to tell you what to call it. I am going to trust you to feel the weight of it, because you can, and because the people who buried this were counting on you never being given the chance. This is what a certain kind of hidden history actually looks like, and it is far quieter and far more patient than the dramatic version people expect. It is not a single grand conspiracy in a smoke-filled room. It is a tendency. It is the way certain places, certain events, certain truths get worn down and carried off and forgotten, always by means that can be explained, until all that remains is a shape in the fog and a feeling in the chest of the few who go looking. The Braddock barn is not important because two men were monsters. Men have always been monsters. The Braddock barn is important because of what the barn was standing on, and because of how thoroughly the memory of the whole thing was removed from the record, and because that removal is not unique. It is a single visible instance of a process that has happened, and is happening, in 1,000 other places you have also never heard of, for the same reason. There is a word that people who study these hidden histories use, and I use it carefully, because it means something specific, and I do not want it to sound like mysticism when it is really closer to a description. The word is reset. A reset is what happens when a place, or a period, or a people is wiped from the accessible record and painted over with a simpler, more manageable story. It is not always violent, and it is not always sudden. Sometimes a reset is a fire and a rewritten deed. Sometimes it is a generation choosing not to speak of a thing until the children have forgotten there was ever anything to speak of. Sometimes it is a whole landscape buried under a layer of earth, the way so many old buildings across the world are found with their first floors and their doorways sunk below ground level, as though a tide of mud rolled across the land at some point that the standard history cannot quite account for and left the old world half swallowed beneath the new. Whatever the mechanism, the result is the same. The old thing goes down into the dark, and a new and thinner story is laid over the top, and after enough time no one remembers that anything is buried there at all. The cellar beneath the Braddock barn was, in the most literal possible sense, a buried older world with a thinner story laid over the top. The ancient fitted stone was down in the dark. The barn, ordinary and explainable, stood over it, and the Braddocks, whatever else they were, understood the deeper logic of the place they had found. They understood that this was a location built for making things disappear, that it had perhaps always been a location for making things disappear, and that all they had to do was continue a work that the land itself seemed to have been shaped for long before they came. That is the thought that the tidy version of this story cannot survive, and that is the thought it was designed to prevent you from having. What if the brothers were not the origin of the horror at that place, but only its most recent tenants? What if they chose that barn, out of all the barns in Missouri, precisely because some old and patient wrongness in the ground called to the wrongness in them? What was that cellar used for? By whom? In the long centuries before two men from nowhere arrived and simply took up the tools that were already there. We cannot answer that, and the reason we cannot answer that is the whole point. Every avenue that might have let us answer it was closed, deliberately, or by a run of accidents too convenient to fully believe. But we can look at what little survived the resets, and we can listen to the people who lived near that place and passed their unease down through the generations, because folk memory is often the last thing to burn. And the folk memory of the Hollow Ford country, thin and frightened as it is, agrees on a few things that the official record does not contain. It says the land was bad before the Braddocks. It says the barn should never have been used. It says that after the cellar was opened and emptied and the remains were taken away for burial, the men who had gone down into it were never quite the same, that Harlan Wilkes in particular, the deputy who led the way down with the lantern, became a quiet and haunted man who would not speak of what he had seen, and who moved away from the county within a few years and asked that his name not be connected to the case. And it says, in the way these things are always said, half joking and not joking at all, that the ground where the barn stood never did settle right, that crops failed there and animals avoided it, and that the few who tried to build on that spot in the years afterward gave it up and moved on without ever quite being able to explain why. Go looking for the site today and you will find nothing. That is not a figure of speech. There is no marker, no ruin, no preserved cellar, no plaque telling passing travellers that 44 people were gathered from the road and hidden in the ground at that spot. The stonework is gone, broken up, and carried off long ago. The barn is gone. The old straight road has been rerouted or paved over or simply lost under a newer road that follows a slightly different line, as though even the path itself has been quietly encouraged to forget where it used to lead. If you knew exactly where to stand, and you almost certainly do not, you would be standing in an ordinary field or an ordinary patch of woods in an ordinary part of Missouri, with nothing to tell you that the earth beneath your feet was ever anything other than earth. And that, I have come to believe, is the most honest monument this story has. Not a stone, not a name carved anywhere, an absence, a deliberate, maintained, generations deep absence in the exact shape of the thing that was removed. The people who did the removing would consider that a success. I would like us, tonight, to consider it a crime scene of its own, because here is what the erasure actually costs. Beyond the insult to the truth, it cost the dead their names. 44 people, at the very least, and in reality certainly more, were ended in that place, and the overwhelming majority of them lie today in unmarked graves, under records that no longer exist, unmourned by descendants who never learned they had someone to mourn. Somewhere there are families, right now, alive today, who carry an old, unexplained gap in their family history, a great-great-grandmother's sister who went west and was simply never heard from again, a branch of the family tree that ends in a question mark in the 1880s. Some of those question marks lead to the Braddock barn. Those living people will almost certainly never know it, because the thread that could have connected them to the truth was cut and burned and paved over on purpose a long time ago. When we talk about a reset, when we talk about hidden history, this is what we are really talking about, not an abstract puzzle. Real people, then and now, robbed of the one thing that even the poorest and most forgotten human being is owed, which is to be remembered as having existed at all. I want to come back to Margaret Voss one last time, because her part in this does not end in that cellar, and what she did afterward is the thread of light running through an otherwise lightless story. Margaret could have gone home once she had recovered her sister. No one would have blamed her. She had done more than anyone had a right to expect, more than the entire apparatus of the law had managed. But Margaret understood something that the men around her did not, or did not want to. She understood that her list was the only complete record that existed, that it lived nowhere but on her own sheets of paper and in her own memory, and that if she did nothing, the same forces that had already begun to close over this story would eventually close over the names as well. So Margaret copied her list. She made more than one copy, and she gave them to different people in different places, and she wrote down, in her own steady hand, everything she had learned, every name, every family, every letter, so that the account could not be destroyed by a single fire in a single building. It is very likely that the only reason we can tell any of this to you tonight, the only reason the number 44 survived at all when almost every official trace was lost, is that one grieving woman refused to trust the record to anyone but herself and made sure the truth existed in more than one place at once. Think about what that means. Every technique of erasure we have described, the scattered crime, the convenient fire, the lost manuscript, the paved over ground, all of it depends on the truth living in only one place, one vulnerable point that can be reached and removed. Margaret's answer to that, worked out on her own, in grief, without help, was to make the truth exist in many places at the same time, so that it could not be reached and removed. That is the single most important lesson this entire dark story has to teach, and it is a lesson for us, right now, tonight. The reason these histories can be hidden is that they are allowed to live in only one fragile place. The reason they can be recovered is that ordinary, stubborn people insist on copying them, carrying them, saying them aloud, refusing to let them rest in a single burnable point. Margaret Voss did not have a printing press or an archive or a single ally with any power. She had paper and a refusal, and that was very nearly enough to defeat a machine built across who knows how many centuries. Imagine what a few thousand people who refused in the same way could do. That brings us to the part of this that reaches past the barn, past Missouri, past the 1880s, and lands squarely in the present, with you. Because if the Braddock barn were the only place like this, it would be a curiosity, a single dark hole in the record, unsettling but contained. It is not the only place. Once you learn to recognize the pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. The old structure with the impossibly precise stonework that the official history credits to people who could not have built it. The straight road older than its supposed builders. The event involving the disappearance or the death of the poor and the friendless, recorded thinly and then not at all. The fire, the flood, the lost archive, the cleared ground, the story reduced to rumour and then to nothing. It is a grammar. It is a way that things get removed from the shared memory of the human race, and it has been operating for so long and so patiently that most people cannot see it at all, because they have only ever been shown the thin story laid over the top, and they have been taught to laugh at anyone who suggests there is something buried underneath. I am asking you not to laugh. I am asking you to look, not to believe blindly, because blind belief is just another way of being managed, but to look, honestly and carefully, the way Harlan Wilkes looked when he did not want the list to be true and checked it anyway. Look at the places near where you live that carry an old, unexplained unease. Look at the local stories that the respectable histories skip over. Look at the fires that took the records, the buildings that sank below the ground, the roads that go straight where no road should, the people who vanished and were never counted. You will not find a barn full of the dead in every case, and I am not suggesting that you will. but you will begin to find the grammar, the pattern of erasure, the shape of the process itself, and once you can see the process, it can never fully hide from you again. That is the one thing the resets cannot survive. They cannot survive being seen for what they are by enough people at once. So, let me tell you what the Braddock Brothers, and whatever older thing used that place before them, and whatever patient process erased it afterward, were all counting on. They were counting on the distance between people. They were counting on the fact that the traveller on the road had no one close enough to raise the alarm in time. They were counting on the fact that each anxious letter would be read alone, by one man who held only one piece. They were counting on the fact that the county could not see the pattern, that the fire would take the records, that the manuscript would be lost, that the ground would be paved, that the story would fade, and that 4 generations later you would sit where you are sitting now, having never heard a single word of it. Every element of their success, from the first vanished peddler to the last cleared acre, depended on people being separated from one another and from the truth. And every element of their defeat, all of it, every scrap of it, came from the opposite thing. From a sister who kept the letters, from a deputy who checked the list, from a woman who copied the truth into many hands so it could not be burned out of one. Connection defeated them. Memory defeated them. The simple, stubborn refusal to let a fellow human being be erased is the only force that has ever beaten this thing, and it is a force that every single person watching this possesses. 44 people went into the ground beneath that barn, at the very least, and most of them we will never be able to name. But we named a few tonight. We named Josiah Kern, the peddler who carried news and goods up and down 3 states for 11 years and told a farmer's wife he was going to press on to the big old barn where 2 decent fellows would put a man up for the night. We named Eleanor Voss, the schoolteacher who chose the children no one else would teach and carried a trunk of books west along a hard road, who wrote home with love right up to the end, and whose own bundle of letters was found tied with string in the cold. And we named Margaret, who was not among the dead, who was the reason the dead are not entirely forgotten, whose paper and refusal outlasted a machine built to erase. As long as we say those names, some small and stubborn part of the erasure has failed. That is not nothing. In a story this dark, it may be the only victory available to us, and I think it is a real one. Somewhere out there tonight, under an ordinary Missouri field, the ground still holds what is left of them. There is no marker, there is no name. There is only the earth, and the old wrong shape of a thing that was carefully removed, and the few of us who now know to stand at the edge of that absence and refuse to look away. The people who buried all of this counted on you never knowing it existed. You know now. That changes something. It does not bring the 44 back, and it does not answer the deepest question about what that cellar truly was before 2 men from nowhere found it. But it means the erasure is no longer complete. It means the story got out, into more than one place, into more than one mind, into yours. And that, in the end, is the only thing these hidden histories have ever truly been afraid of. If this account moved you, and if you believe the 44 deserve to be remembered, then do the one thing that actually works against forgetting. Share this. Send it to one person tonight who has never heard it, so that the story lives in another place it can never be burned out of. And if you want to go deeper, if you want to see the full account laid out with the names and the records and the patterns set side by side, everything that survived the resets is gathered in the document linked below this video, along with the next case, a place with the same grammar of erasure written all over it, a story that the tidy version of history would also very much prefer you never hear. Grab the document and then watch the next investigation, already waiting for you on the screen. The people who did this counted on the silence. Let us be the ones who break it. Say their names, keep the copies, and I will see you in the next one.